Hello, class. I put this video together to try to help you go through the process of using Microsoft Access and creating a database, which includes relating multiple tables together so that you can create a solution. We talked about this in one of our lectures where we talked about using Microsoft Excel to collect data, which we've done in the past. And one of the things we found is that Microsoft Excel does not provide the ability to relate databases together. The databases in Microsoft Excel would be shown using a worksheet. So we talked about using Microsoft Access, which allows information to be stored similarly to what Microsoft Excel does. The difference is that we're going to be able to relate databases together using specific field information. So what I did was I put together a document to talk about what we're going to be covering in this video. And the information that I have here is just for an exercise. What I'm going to have you do at the end of this particular lecture is to actually put the concepts that we're going to be learning in this lecture with your book, your publisher book database information that you put together for this week. But I'm doing it with a slightly different twist. I'm using this activity to keep track of computer information for lab equipment for our department. And what I'm going to be doing here, you can directly apply the concepts to relating the publisher information to the book information that we talked about when we started talking about Microsoft Access. Okay, so for this particular activity, what we're going to be doing is creating two tables of information. One is going to be used to hold computer vendor information, and the other is going to be used to hold the actual computers that we have in the department. So we have two tables we'll be creating in Microsoft Access. And the first table is going to be called, I'm giving it a name called comp vendors, short for computer vendors. And each individual vendor in my database is going to include 4 fields of information. So the comp vendors database or the table is going to include a computer, the vendor ID, the vendor name, the vendor location, and the system architecture. So for instance, if we happen to have a computer vendor, Dell, we're going to have an ID for each of the vendors. And that ID, that vendor ID is going to be unique. Only one vendor could have vendor ID 1. It's going to be unique. So there's something special about that, and we'll talk about that in a little while. We're looking for something in our tables to be unique. In my situation, the vendor ID is unique. We could have a computer vendor that is located in Baltimore, Maryland. We may have another vendor that's available in Baltimore, Maryland, but they cannot have the same vendor ID. So for instance, if Hewlett-Packard and Toshiba both had a location in Baltimore, Maryland, Hewlett-Packard would have one vendor ID and Dell would have a different vendor ID. So we're looking always to find out what could be unique about that table that we can tell Access there's something very unique about this particular field. In the computer vendors table, then computer vendors or comp vendors, the unique field is going to be the vendor ID. For our database for the department computers, I'm calling that table department computers or DEPT computers. That's going to be the table name. And the table is going to include multiple fields. If you recall, when we first started talking about Microsoft Access, we talked about the smallest piece of information in a database is a character. A collection of related characters is a field. A collection of related fields is a record. A collection of related records is a file. And a collection of related files is called a database. In this particular case, our table or database, DEPT computers, which is going to be the department computers database, is going to also contain 4 fields. And those fields include the computer ID, the vendor ID, the computer model, and the computer serial number. And I have the actual field names listed next to the actual descriptions for computer ID, vendor ID, computer model, and serial number, respectively. Okay, so this is a pretty straightforward process. You did this with your assignment that was due for this week, where you had to create a database for publishers, and you had to create a database for books. And there were specific fields associated with each table. Okay, so one of the things that I wanted you to take a look at here is this last line. It says that in order to relate one table with another, there has to be something that has to be unique. And we're going to be using, since we have a uniqueness with the vendor ID, we're going to be using the vendor ID to connect table 1 to table 2. So if you take a look at the individual fields that are available for table 1, which is comp vendors, vendor ID happens to be a unique field in our database. In the database or the table depth computers or the department computers, notice that vendor ID is also showing up. So what's going to happen is there's going to be a connection a little bit later on when we get into Microsoft Access to connect vendor ID from this table, comp vendors, to the vendor ID field for the department computers table. And it's going to be that connection that allows Microsoft Access to relate one table with another. Okay? Now, we're going to get into this more practically when we get into Microsoft Access, but I wanted to speak about the table relationships a little more in detail. And the way that we take a look at the tables, recall when I had shared before that when we're dealing with a table, there typically has to be something unique within the table. In the computers vendors table or comp vendors, the unique field in this database is the vendor ID. There could only be one vendor 1, one vendor 2, and so on. However, in the department computers database or depth computers, the uniqueness or the unique field in this database is the computer ID. I want you to imagine in our classroom when we have about 30 computers set up, one for each student, they're all made by one company. The computers in the computer lab in Knot Hall 006 are made by a company called Lenovo. It's the next version of the IBM company. So Lenovo, there's a whole series of Lenovo computers, but there can only be one of the particular type of computer that you're sitting at because it has a unique serial number. But in this particular case, we're going to be using the computer ID. Each computer in that room has a unique number. There can only be one number 1, one number 2. Anytime you start speaking a language that there's going to be a uniqueness about the data in the database, that's typically referred to as the what they call the primary key. Now, the primary key in a database in Microsoft Access reflects the uniqueness about that table. And in the case that we're referring to in the comp vendor table, vendor ID happens to be the unique component of that database. In the database called department computer or depth computers for the department computers, the unique field in that database is computer ID or comp ID. Now, if you'll notice that in the department computers database, vendor ID also shows up in that database. And so in the architecture of Access tables, there is a unique terminology that's associated with each of these components. Okay, so let's take them one at a time. If you take a look at the table comp vendor, which is the table that's used to keep track of the individual vendors of the computers that we have at the university, the primary key or the unique field in that database is Vend ID. Now, when we get into Microsoft Access, you're going to see that the primary key has a little icon associated with it in the graphical representation of the table. And that graphical representation or the icon for that particular field is going to have a little a little yellow key associated with it. In the table department computers, the unique field in the depth computers table is comp ID. There's only each individual value in that field is unique. Recall earlier I had said that there can only be one number one. There could be only one number two. In other words, if you take a look at the computers in the lab, in our classroom, there can only be one computer one, and there can only be one computer two. They may be all the same model. They may be all by the same vendor. There could be multiple Dells. There could be multiple Lenovos, but there can only be one number one in the collection of computers in the room. So the uniqueness to this particular table for department computers is comp ID. That's called the primary key. Now, if you notice what we have here in there's a new term called the foreign key. And the foreign key is associated with the primary key from a different table. So in the comp vendor table, the primary key for that table is vend ID. If we use that field in a different table, it's referred to as the foreign key. So the foreign key has to have a primary key from a different table in order to be associated with. So now that we have the overall structure of what we need to do, let's get started in actually trying to create these two tables and the individual fields in our database. Okay. Now, before we actually start Microsoft Access, one of the things we got to keep in mind is that when we get into Microsoft Access, one of the things we're going to be responsible for taking care of is assigning a particular data type. And one of the things that we spoke about when we first started speaking about databases in Microsoft Access is that each field is going to hold a particular type of data. Some of the examples were short text, long text, number, date, time, auto number. And so one of the things that I'd like to do here is put together for one of the tables the type of data we're going to be holding in each of these fields, so we understand exactly what we're going to be expected to do when we deal with Microsoft Access. So one of the typical fields that we're associating with a primary key is that since we want to make sure that each piece of data going into the table through the fields is unique, it's very important that we don't have duplicate values. One of the ways that Microsoft Access assures us not to have duplicate values is to have Microsoft Access keep track of the numbering system for us. So whenever we have a primary key, the typical data type for that particular field is going to be auto number. So I'm just going to put auto number right next to the vend ID because it's exactly what we're going to be using, the type of data we're going to be using for that field. Let's go on to the next, vendor name. Now, the question that's typically asked when you're putting together a database is there going to be any calculation that's going to be done on this particular field? Since this is going to be a vendor name like Dell, HP, Apple, Sony, Lenovo, you're not going to have any calculations based on that word. So the typical example, the typical data type for this particular field is going to be short text. Now, short text, if you recall, has a maximum of 255 characters of data space that you can put in for the name. It's an awful lot of overkill, but it's a lot better than the long text, which is up to 64,000 characters. So let's continue on. So for the vendor location, again, there's not going to be any calculation done, so I'm going to choose short text again. And architecture is going to be the type of architecture for the computers, like PC versus Mac. And so this too is going to have short text. Now, let's continue on by dealing with the data type for the department computers table. And since the computer ID was identified as being a unique field, we're going to call this, we're going to assign this as a auto-numbered field. Now, the vendor ID field, we got to stop for a moment and take a look at this. If you'll notice that the vendor ID field in the comp vendors table is considered auto number. It's an actual number data type, but what Microsoft Access is going to do, it's going to automatically assign a number to that particular record. So since Vend ID is a foreign key associated with the Vend ID as the primary key in the comp vendors table, this is going to be assigned a number data type. Okay, so number and number. Now, if you don't assign this a number, if you said, well, it's a number up in the comp vendors table, I'll just call this short text. What's going to happen is Microsoft Access will flag an error telling you that you can't match a number with a text field. So you want to make sure that you keep consistent with the data type that is consistent with the primary key. Now, the computer model is your the type of computer like the what are we talking about? The computer model, which is going to be considered Asus and Apple and Sony. And those are words. So I'm going to assign that as a data type short text. And for the serial number, well, it appears that the serial number can be a number data type. We're not going to do any calculations on serial numbers. Like, we're not going to take a serial number of a computer and multiply it by 25. Okay, so I'm going to assign this to a short text as well. Okay? So we have our individual table names. We have comp vendors and depth computers, and we have individual field names for each individual table, and I have the data type associated with each individual field. So now at this point, we have everything that we need to go into Microsoft Access and start working with building our tables, and then creating the individual fields within each table. And then what we'll do is we'll finish up with creating a relationship between the two before we start adding data to our individual tables. So let's start. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start Microsoft Access. Your version of Microsoft Access may be a little bit different, but for the activity that we're doing right now, the version that I'm using here is going to be just fine. When you come into Access, you're going to be given an option to pick either a blank database or a different type of a database. These are templates that are available to you from the Microsoft Corporation. But for the sake of this activity, since we want to build our own database, we're going to choose the blank desktop database. Now, some of you, when you actually do this in Microsoft Access on the computers in the lab, and by the way, let me share with you that what I'm about to show you is not possible to be done on your laptop unless you have a PC and unless you have Microsoft Access installed on that PC. My strong suggestion is that you go to a computer, a Loyola computer on campus, because when you log in with your user credentials, you'll have access to your G drive, which is what you'll need in this next step. So I'm going to go ahead and start the blank desktop database, and you're given the choice of where do you want to put the database. Now I want you to take a look here. The default location that it's going to, Microsoft Access is going to put this database is on my local drive. It's called the C drive in a folder called Documents. That's not where I want to put it, nor should you. You want to be able to put it in the Access folder on your G drive. So once you're at this screen, this is the overall name of the database, but I don't want to put that name in yet until I actually point access to my G drive. So I'm going to click on this folder icon, and it'll bring up the folders that I've got, and here's my G drive. And I'm actually doing this through my work drive. So I'm going to click on Home, go into CS Spring of 2019. I'm going to go into my folder. I'm going to go to Access. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in here the name of what I'm trying to create. And it's called Computer System Database. Now, all I did was I put in the file name. What's important is you keep the suffix of the file, which is ACCDB. Don't take that away. You want to make sure that's there. So in this particular case, I put in computer system database. Your file, when you create your book database, you'll have a completely different name. And we'll talk about that more a little bit later on. But I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And when I do that, you'll notice that the path for where this file is going to be stored is now updated. It says G drive, and it tells me where I'm going to put it. You want to make sure that you follow the path so it has access at the end. Here's my file that I'm going to create. And then the last step is to go ahead and click on Create. And when I do, Microsoft Access will start creating that database, and it'll bring you to the individual components of what this tool is going to look like. So, a couple of things to take into consideration. This view should probably look familiar if you've been through the MyLab IT exercise. I had you do that so you can see how to get into the tool and the kinds of things you should start seeing once you come in. Now, as soon as you come into a brand new database, Access is going to assume that you want to start creating a database. So you'll notice, just like when you come into Microsoft Word, you come into Document 1. If you come into Microsoft Excel, you come into Book 1. Well, in Microsoft Access, they're assuming that you're going to start doing some sort of database work. So they put you into Table 1. Now, they've already given you an auto-numbered database type. Now, you know that because it says the words new under the field called ID. Now, we're going to fix that because if you recall, let's take a quick look at what we're trying to create. We're trying to create a table called Comp Vendors with 4 fields: Vend ID, Vend Name, Vend Location, and Sys Design. Once we come into the Access tool, we're going to start creating those pieces. So let's take a look. Our second field is going to be called Vend Name. So I'm going to choose the data type, which is going to be a short text. And I'm going to go ahead and type in, when it catches up, Vend Name. And then I'm going to go ahead and let's take a look. We have our data type is going to be short text. And that short text is going to be Vend Location. And then I have one more to put in. I think it's called Sys Design. And that's also going to be a short text. And I'll put in my field name, which is Sys Design. Now, one of the things that we have to do is we have to change this ID or this field name to Vend ID, because what I have is just simply ID. And what I did was I double clicked on the ID field and I just start typing in how I want my table to be. So according to what I have in my design document, I want to have a table called Comp Vendors. And it should have 4 fields: Vend ID, Vend Name, Vend Location, and System Design. If I come back into my table, I have my individual fields: Vend ID, Vend Name, Vend Location, and I can actually open this up a little bit, Vend Design, and I have nothing here because I don't have any other fields that I want to work with. And so at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to close out this table, and you'll see that Microsoft Access has not saved the table name yet, so I'm going to go ahead and click on Close, and Microsoft immediately will ask me if I want to save the design of Table 1. It's called Table 1 now. I'm going to change the name of it to Comp Vendors. And click OK. And Microsoft Access will take the responsibility of taking that table with all those individual fields, place it into the database, and then update the left-hand side of the application to show that I have my table called Comp Vendors. It's exactly what I was looking for, okay? So what I've done is I've taken the responsibility of doing at least this part, okay? So it isn't that you have to put together a design document. I like putting together a design document only because you can actually go between the two applications and you can keep track of exactly what you're doing to make sure everything is exactly the way it's supposed to be. Okay? Now, let's get back into Microsoft Access and put together our next table called Department Computers, or Dept Computers is the name. It too will contain 4 fields: Comp ID, Vend ID, Comp Model, and Comp Serial Number, or Comp SN. Okay, so let's go back into Access. And this time, since we're already in Microsoft Access, I'm going to start creating a new table a different way. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to click on Create, and then I'm going to choose Table from the Create ribbon. And when I do that, it'll start the exact same process. It's got a new table. It's called Table 1, and we're going to start that process again. So according to our design document, we have auto number data type for the ID field. We have a number data type for the Vend ID. So we have to add, we're going to add Vend ID, Comp Model, and Comp Serial Number. So let's go ahead and do that now. And so we want it to have a number, and we're going to call that Vend ID. Recall that in this particular table, this will be the foreign key, which is associated with the Vend ID as the primary key in our comp vendors table. A lot of things to take into consideration, I know. Okay, so now that that's done, I'm going to add my next table, my next field, which is Comp Model, and that's a short text data type, Comp Model. And then I have one more to add in, and that is Comp Serial Number, which is also a short text because I'm not going to do any calculations. I'm going to do a Comp Serial Number, Comp SN. And then we talked about that we have to come in here and change this to Comp ID. According to our design document, it's called Comp ID. That's the unique field for this particular table. This will be the primary key of this particular table, Department or Dept Computers. All right, so let's go back into Access, and let's double click on the field, Comp ID. It's already listed as an auto number, which is great. We don't have to do anything really. And we're basically done with that particular field. And table. We have all of our tables. We have Comp ID, Vend ID, which is a number field type or data type, Comp Model, Comp Serial Number. Let's make sure we have them right. Comp ID, Vend ID, Comp Model, and Comp Serial Number. Great. Okay, the only thing left to do here is I'm going to go ahead and close out, but because we have a table that hasn't been saved yet, I'm going to choose Save, and we're going to call this particular table Department or Dept Computers. Make sure I spelled it right and it's got the right case, and click OK. Once that's done, you'll see the name change, and I'm basically done with creating my tables. Now, there's no data in the tables. I've just created the structure to put the data in. Okay, so let's go back to our design document, and it looks like I've created everything that I've needed for my second table. All right. Now, the only thing that I have left to do, since this is supposed to be a relational database solution, is to be able to relate one table with another using the vendor ID. Recall from earlier, we said that it's the vendor ID that allows us to connect the comp vendor table with the department or Dept Computers table. Now we have to use that particular field, okay? So let me show you how to do that in Microsoft Access. It involves creating what's referred to as a relationship. Now, if you think about relationships in general, typically when you have a relationship with another individual, there's something in common, all right? That's the mindset of the relationship idea in Microsoft Access. What's common between these two tables, comp vendors and Dept Computers? What's common? What's common is the vendor ID. So we're going to be using that individual field, to create what's referred to as a relationship. More specifically, we're going to be creating a one-to-many relationship. There are three basic relationship types in Microsoft Access: a one-to-one, a one-to-many, and a many-to-many. In our case, we're going to be creating what's referred to as a one-to-many relationship. The reason why we're doing that is because if you think about what the comp vendors table is going to hold, it might hold a company like Dell. It might hold a company like Hewlett-Packard. It might hold a company like Apple. But in the department, there may be many Apple computers. So one vendor called Apple may have many instances within the department. So that is a typical classic example of a one-to-many relationship. So let me show you how to take care of that particular piece. And in order to do that, we have to bring up the database tool called Relationships. Now, when you get into Microsoft Access, you'll see a ribbon called the Database Tools ribbon. And on the Database Tools ribbon, you have a function called Relationships. And when you click on Relationships, you will be given the Show Table dialog box. And if you'll notice, you see the two tables that we've created in Access just a little while ago. I'm going to take this window and pull it off to the side, and you'll understand why in a moment. What I've done is I'm going to, since my computer vendor table, or the comp vendors table, is the one where I'm going to have one of each company, each computer company, but the department computers can have potentially multiple computers by that individual vendor or individual vendors. I'm going to put the comp vendors table on the left and the department computers table to the right. You can do this in a variety of ways. You can simply double click on the table and it'll appear in the relationships workspace, or you can click once, which in this case I'm choosing comp vendors, and I'm going to click add, and you'll see it appear on the workspace. Then I'm going to take my next table and place it right next to it. And then I'm going to go ahead and close my relationship show table dialog box. Now, once you have your tables here, you can actually take them and move them around. I'm going to create a bit of a spacing, and you'll understand why in a moment. I'm just going to do this so you can see what I'm doing. A couple of things that I wanted to share with you that I need you to be mindful of. If you recall from our original design document, it said that in the comp vendor table, the vendor ID is the primary key. This is the unique piece of this particular table called comp vendor. However, in the department or the department computers table, or DEPT computers, comp ID is the primary key. So it should make logical sense that when we go to the design view, the relationships view in Microsoft Access, the individual fields that we've created as auto number, which are considered unique fields, should have the little primary key icon next to the individual field name. So this is perfect, okay? Now, the only thing that we have left to do, according to what we have here, since the vendor ID will be used to relate the comp vendors table with the department computers table, all we have left to do is to connect the vendor ID as the primary key from the comp vendors table to the vendor ID field as the foreign key in the department computers or DEPT computers table. A lot of words for something very straightforward. Let me show you how to do that here. In order to create the relationship, the one-to-many, in other words, we have one vendor. We have a series of vendors like HP, Dell, Apple, Sony, Lenovo, Acer. We're going to have a series of vendors, but we may have multiple computers from each vendor. So in order to create the one-to-many relationship, we simply move our mouse on top of the primary key from comp vendors, click and drag to the right until you connect with the Vend ID field in the depth computers table. So I'm basically taking the primary key from comp vendors and connecting it to the foreign key in depth computers table. Once you hover over the top of it and you let it go, you'll get an edit relationship window. I'm going to pull this down a little bit so you can see it. Now, I know that most of you understand how to do this in terms of clicking and dragging. If in the event, by clicking and dragging, you happen to miss going from Vend ID from the left over to the right, you can change that here. You can make sure that you're choosing the right field in the appropriate table. In this case, it's already connected. I have my primary key, which is Vend ID in comp vendors table, associated with Vend ID, which is the foreign key in this case, with the table department computers. You'll want to verify this information is accurate when you put together your publisher book database, because I think in your case, with the publisher book relationship, I think that the relationship that you're going to be creating is based on the pub ID. Okay, so in this particular case, I have these two pieces that are connected together, but there's a couple of other things that I wanted to share with you. You'll notice that it's going to automatically create what's referred to as a one-to-many. It understands what you're trying to do, so it's creating a one-to-many relationship. But there are a couple of things that you want to do before you click on create. You want to put a check mark next to where it says enforce referential integrity, meaning that what Microsoft Access is going to do is make sure that when the auto number on the left-hand side, in this case, the comp vendors table, which is a number, is associated with the vendor ID field in the department computers table, that that Access makes sure that the data types are matching. Okay, and that's very important. I also want you to put a check mark next to Cascade Update and Cascade Delete, meaning that if we happen to get rid of an entire piece of information, in other words, if we get rid of a vendor in our comp vendors table, if we completely get rid of Apple as a potential vendor at the university, we want to get rid of the associated computers in this database. If we get rid of the vendor, Apple, and we don't get rid of the computers in the department, that means we'll have what's referred to as orphaned records. That means that we don't have a vendor called Apple, but we keep on dealing with the computers of Apple, and that wouldn't make any sense. So the Cascade Update and Cascade Delete will take care of making sure that everything housekeeping-wise is okay within the database solution. So just quickly, before I click on Create, we have our table comp vendors with our primary key Vend ID associating with the foreign key Vend ID for the department computers or depth computers database or table. Once I have that selected, I have 3 check marks under Enforce Referential Integrity, Cascade Update, and Cascade Delete of the fields and records. And when I click on Create, what I get here is a line that connects between the two tables. If you look carefully, you should see that the connection from the left, which has a 1 associated with it, and it's connected to the next table, which is Depth Computers, has a little infinity icon associated with it. That is Microsoft Access's way of saying we have a one-to-many relationship. And in the case that I'm showing here, what it's basically showing you is that, again, in this case, we could have individual vendors in our comp vendors database, but since there's only one Dell and there's one Apple and one Sony and one Lenovo in our vendors database, we can have multiple computers from Lenovo in our department. That's what practically it looks like to have a one-to-many relationship. Okay, now this is a critical piece in dealing with the Access database architecture. So when I go ahead and close the database, it's going to attempt to ask me if I want to save because it is actually working with the overall architecture of the individual tables. So I'm going to go ahead and choose yes to make sure that Access does take the responsibility of maintaining what that relationship is. Okay, so I'm basically done in creating the overall structure of what the database is going to look like for this particular example. If I go back into my design document, I've created my relationships where I've used the vendor ID to relate the comp vendors table with the department or depth computers table. I've done it according to this design where I've taken my vend ID field in comp vendor and I associated that with the vend ID field in the depth computers table, and that's referred to as a primary to foreign key relationship. The comp ID field in the depth computers table automatically is called a primary key. It's not associated with anything yet. I may develop another table at some point and want to associate that with a field in another table. And then we can create a primary foreign relationship there. But for the time being, we've satisfied the requirement here. So I'm going to go ahead and mark that as completed. Okay, and we've actually done this as well. So I'm going to go ahead and take care of that. And really the only thing at this point that we would actually be able to do would be to actually start populating our tables with data. So let me go ahead and open up my table called comp vendors. And the way that you actually enter data, this is a little bit, a little unique. Since Microsoft Access is automatically keeping track of the vendor IDs, you don't have to put any information there. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to come in and start putting in my first vendor, and that is Toshiba. And if you notice that as I started typing the vendor name, notice that the Microsoft Access automatically associated that record with one. Remember that a record is a collection of related fields. So record one includes the vendor ID, the vendor name, the vendor location, and the system design. That's one record, okay? So let me finish putting in this information. So they're located in Houston, Texas, and they make the PC. And I'm going to hit Tab, and I'm going to go to my next vendor, which is Dell, and they're located in Round Rock, Texas, and they're developers of PCs. And I'm going to come into HP, and they're located in Austin, Texas, and they also make PCs. And so you get the idea how we're starting to populate our tables. Now, so far, in this particular table, let's just speak the language. The table is called Comp Vendors. Comp Vendors has 4 individual fields. The field names are Vend ID, Vend Name, Vend Location, and Sys Design. I currently have 3 records in this database or table, and the records include 4 individual fields, including the Vend ID, the vendor name, the vendor location, and the system design. The 3 records that I have are vendor 1 is Toshiba, located in Houston, Texas. They develop PCs. Vendor number 2 is Dell. They're located in Round Rock, Texas, and they develop PCs. Vendor number 3, notice they're all unique. We could have HP. In this case, record number 3 is HP, located in Austin, Texas, and they also develop PCs. Now, I want you to see something that's going to be a little different from what you saw earlier, is that when we go ahead and close out this table, the system does not ask me to save. And that's because Microsoft Access treats data so carefully that as you're entering data into the individual fields, when you go to the next field, it automatically saves your work. So most people don't believe it. So I'm just going to open up the comp vendors table so you can see that that data actually does exist within the table. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and close this table. And then I'm going to open up my department computers, and I'm going to start populating some information here. Vendor ID. Actually, I'm going to open up both of these tables. You can open up multiple tables simultaneously. My vendor ID 2 is associated with Dell, so I have a couple of Dell computers. So I have 2, and that is the Latitude D830, and my serial number is, I'm making this up, okay, and I'm going to have another Dell, and that's going to be the Latitude E6420, and that is serial number 3110, whatever you want to call it. And I want you to notice that the comp ID is unique. There's only one, there's only one 2, but the vendor ID is associated with the vendor ID from comp vendors. So I could have multiple Dell computers, I just can't have multiple comp IDs. Like I can't have 2 number 1s. That doesn't make any sense. It has to be something unique about that table. Okay, let me see what else I have here. Let's put in a Toshiba, and that is going to be ID 1, and that's going to be the special Pro 2, and that is serial number 32237655. Okay, so that data is now entered, and I can continue putting in my data. And since I just put in data, I haven't modified anything about the table, not the column width, not the individual field names. All I have to do is close, and it didn't ask me to save. My comp vendors table, I can also close, and I'm basically starting to populate the individual pieces of information that we're dealing with as far as these individual tables. Okay? So that completes this exercise dealing with starting to put data into Access in terms of creating a design document to put together what we needed to for our individual tables. In this exercise, I put together 2 tables, entered the individual fields into the tables. I assigned a specific data type to each of the individual fields, and then I created a relationship, a one-to-many relationship between the 2 tables, so I could start the process of being able to put information in and then be able to relate the tables so we can work with this information later over the course of the next several lectures. So what I would like you to do as you come into working with the information that you put together for your publisher book database is that before the next class, what I would like you to do is to be able to create your tables in Microsoft Access. And as you create your tables, you're going to be creating the individual fields that you were supposed to create in Microsoft Access. And then I'd like you to start putting in your data, just like I did, into my individual tables. In my comp vendors, I started putting in my information. Remember that in the auto-numbered field, wherever you see new, you don't touch that. Microsoft Access will keep track of it. It's keeping track of making sure there's only one 1, and one number 2, and one number 3. You start putting information in outside of the auto-numbered field. Okay? So in your case, you're going to be putting together the database for the publishers, the database for the books. Once that's created, you're going to be then populating the data into the individual tables. And then I want that to be taken care of before our next class, at the start of class. I'll put this information in terms of a requirement on the class Moodle site so you know exactly what you'll be doing. But I wanted to put together this video so that this way you had a really good understanding of exactly what you had to do in terms of translating your design document, which is what you've already done, into a practical application in Microsoft Access. So that's about it. If you have any questions, certainly you can share it with me. And I look forward to seeing you in class when we get together to meet again.